This is the unmistakable sound of Frédéric Chopin. A shy and private man, his music speaks of raw emotion, and his sublime compositions for the piano inspire profound passion in both players and listeners. Chopin wrote over 250 compositions for the piano and drew from the instrument an intense singing quality. That inspiration for his music was not only the keyboard, but also the human voice, in particular, the female voice. As we celebrate Chopin's 200th anniversary, we follow a young pianist as he sets out to discover who put the song into Chopin.
Do I identify with Chopin as a man? On some level, yeah. I mean, of course I do. It seems like the most arrogant thing in the world to say that I identify with Chopin as a man, but if I look at the emotions within him, then hell yeah. I mean, the kind of malaise that he had, the awkwardness.
James Rhodes studied the piano as a teenager, but never went to music college. He went off to work in the city, but in his late 20s he realized he couldn't resist his desire to play any longer. Now 34, he's a full-time concert pianist with a recording contract and with a youthful and growing following.
I'm obsessed with music. I live for the piano. I am not entirely comfortable with people or in the outside world. The only big difference I would say is that I have maybe a thousandth of the genius that he actually had.
Chopin's genius was to create a whole new language for the piano. A language that was heavily influenced by his passion for singing, opera singing. Chopin was obsessed with the popular, vocally athletic Italian opera of the day known as bel canto, the opera of Bellini, Donizetti, and Rossini.
Now, bel canto, literally beautiful singing. The bel canto ethos, as you might say, was obviously nourished and to a certain extent formed by what he heard as a child in Warsaw. But I think it was so much a part of his whole aesthetic background that had he not heard it, he would have invented it.
Chopin, the voice was the ultimate musical instrument. It was the ultimate art form. And he was, I think, fascinated by any woman who could really sing.
Who were these singers that were so important to Chopin? What influence did they have on his music? As a Chopin besotted pianist, James is keen to answer these questions and has enlisted the help of rising star, 23-year-old Welsh opera singer Natalia Romaniw.
Okay. You can hit a B flat. All right.
Okay.
You ready? Wow.
That's really like
really
got a lot of legato line in it for the voice.
It's operatic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is.
James is undertaking a journey which he hopes will help him to discover the real women whose voices can still be heard inside Chopin's music. The journey begins in Warsaw, the city where Chopin grew up, the city he always thought of as home, and which is now celebrating his 200th anniversary as the nation's great cultural hero. Chopin was born in 1810 and grew up in Warsaw, where his father was a teacher at a time when Poland was peaceful and the city was enjoying a cultural renaissance. This was an era when piano makers, encouraged by composers like Beethoven, were rapidly modernizing the piano, transforming it into a stronger, more resonant, and increasingly popular and affordable instrument for the educated classes. In this environment, it was no surprise that Chopin was taught by his mother to play the piano. What was extraordinary was that by the age of 7, he was already composing on the instrument, and by the age of 8, he was being feted in the press as a musical genius. Zofia Czechlinska is a leading academic from Warsaw's Chopin Institute and an expert on Chopin's early life.
Of course, he was surrounded by music. He was quite young. He was 10, 11, 12 when he started to go to the opera. He loved opera. There are many evidences that he loved opera, and he loved singing. There was contact with Angelika Catalani, who performed here in Warsaw.
Angelica Catalani, one of the great divas of the early 19th century, had an astonishing voice famed for its power and range.
Chopin met her in one of the Warsaw salons where he performed. She said that he was wonderful, and then she gave him a watch. It is in Chopin's museum here with the caption to Frederick Chopin, 10 years old pianist. Yes, yes.
Chopin's father, Mikołaj, taught in the main academy for the gentry in Warsaw, a post that provided his son with access to the city's educated and aristocratic society, a world in which the opera house played a pivotal role. Marita Alban Juarez, an expert on Chopin's Warsaw, took James to visit the reconstructed apartment where he lived with his parents.
Wow. So this is exactly where he spent his teenage years. Because of course at 17 he was writing his piano concertos already. The second piano concerto he wrote.
You know, in this room they had first rehearsal for the piano concerto.
Really?
And of course his piano.
Yes, look, this is the second concerto.
Yes,
the slow movement.
Concerto. As you can see, the Chopin handwriting here. Till the last moment, he was correcting everything.
Yeah, amazing. Every note he thought about. I'm getting shivers on my arm. Just thinking this is the room that it was done in.
This is the room.
It's incredible. God, it's an amazing view.
This is the gate of the university. It was
Right opposite.
Yes, it was a university campus.
This is amazing. I can't believe Chopin himself would have looked out over here to see his friends
Yes,
coming over. And
allow Titus, come on.
yes, look at the girls coming out of university.
At least one movement from one of the concertos that Chopin wrote and played in this apartment was inspired by a girl he might well have watched from this window. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "Because, perhaps to my misery, I already have my perfect one whom I have, without saying a word, served faithfully for a year now, of whom I dream, and in whose memory the adagio of my concerto has been written." The girl he was writing about was Konstancja Gladkowska. She was 19, the same age as Chopin, and an opera singer at the Warsaw Conservatoire.
She sang at the first concert Chopin gave, in public concert. He said that it was beautiful, everything. Also when Chopin was already leaving Warsaw, she wrote that you go abroad, you will be famous, you will be well known, you will make a career, but nobody will love you as we love you here.
He was sometimes working as a accompanist also. It happened, of course, in conservatoire.
Okay. Is that how he met Costanza?
Yes, he met Constanza during the recital. He fell in love, and you know, it was very, very sad moment for him because I think Constanza didn't love him.
Okay.
He wasn't happy in his romances.
Yeah. No musicians are happy in their romances, I don't think.
Much of the music that Chopin heard Constantia sing was by Rossini. Natalia Romaniou has recently performed in a Rossini opera called La Scala di Seta, about a girl who marries in secret and whose husband visits her at night with the help of a scala di seta, a ladder of silk.
We'll just play around with it.
So this is the kind of thing that Chopin would have heard, you know, every time he went to the opera or hanging out with his singer friends.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So I'll come in at the start of the bar.
Thank you.
That's too slow.
Yeah. Dun, 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 dun.
Right. Okay. So much fun. I love the piece. I love how it's like 2 pages of an ending. It's just one massive ending.
It's a basic, so the chords are quite basic.
Yeah, exactly. I can really see how You know, you imagine in Warsaw or in Paris, you know, a young Chopin with a beautiful singer with an amazing voice, sitting just the two of them with a candle on, singing the most beautiful Italian arias, stuff like that. It's incredibly intimate, isn't it?
I think his love of bel canto sprung actually more from his love of the voice, the capability of the voice, and the immediacy of the voice. The voice, after all, is not only the most faithful and immediate servant of our musical impulse, the voice is the means by which we express throughout our lives almost all of our inner life.
James's trip to Warsaw coincided with the Chopin International Festival, and he met up with one of the great Chopin pianists, Garrick Olson, to discover how he feels bel canto opera fed into the young composer's music.
Italian opera was the rage in Warsaw, as it was all over Europe. And he had this, he was imbued with this bel canto idea right from the very start, his earliest pieces, that he had the idea of the melody and how to accompany it and how to configure it. So I think it was absolutely present from the start. It was part of his musical blood and part of his musical essence.
But is there anything you do to get that singing tone?
So on the piano, the problem is, all you have is, for a pianist to do, is you have the attack, whatever that is. Then the piano does that. And then the only thing you can control is the release. Now, you have several complex mechanisms in there. You've got a pedal, which will release greater combinations of overtones. But if you want to take a great singing nocturne, such as the D-flat, Opus 27, number 2, if you play it without anything except just the pedal and the tune, it's very pretty, but it's naked.
Yeah.
But Chopin's piano was developing at the time. So what he did, because of the possibility of gathering sounds in the pedal, was to take this figure and spread it over more than 2 octaves. Which already sets up an aura of sound, an envelope, of a beautiful cushion, a texture. And, of course, incredibly clever as he was, or more than clever, a true genius, he understood even how to emphasize certain notes within the texture. Now, we've had we've had plenty of the D-flat, which is the bass, but we've had a disproportionate amount of this F, which is 1 octave below the note where the tune starts. So when you... the ear is already... that F becomes a manifestation of the harmony, but suddenly it's made glamorous, it's clothed, and the overtones are all...
And it's up there above everything else.
Exactly.
So it's like the singer
just like
joining the
with
music.
Orchestra,
exactly.
Yeah. So in that way, yes, he did capture the bel canto kind of melody.
Very early on, once his talent became apparent, he was anointed to become the Polish national opera composer. So not only opera was the place to go and the place to be seen, not only was it the place where he could learn a lot as a musician, as a pianist, but it was also the place where he was to hone his skills for the future as the great Polish composer, opera composer.
But Chopin wasn't ready to write an opera. On the 2nd of November 1830, at the age of 20, he left Warsaw for Vienna on an educational expedition. He had no idea that he was never to return home again. 4 weeks later, Poland exploded into a brief, bloody and doomed revolt against Russian rule. And Chopin's study tour was transformed into exile. Throughout his life, Chopin retained strong links with Warsaw, but he never felt able to return. Instead, he filled his music with Poland, particularly in his polonaises, his short intimate mazurkas, and this, his stirring revolutionary study.
Once he'd reached Vienna, a revolution broke out in Poland, in Warsaw, so he was stuck there. His traveling companion, Titus, his best friend, went back to Poland to fight against the Russians, and Chopin sat around in Vienna not really knowing what to do. Italy was a bit of a no-go area because there were revolutions breaking out there. Finally, he decided to travel to Paris, which, although there had been a revolution there in 1830, had quietened down a bit.
On the second leg of his journey, James is taking the train to Paris to explore the world in which the young Polish musician found himself. Chopin shied away from offering any literal interpretations of his music. He gave little or no information in the titles of his work. And yet, many of his compositions seem imbued with a deep sense of loss and longing, sentiments often attributed to a lifelong homesickness. Homesick or not, when Chopin arrived in Paris, aged 21, he was filled with excitement. He took rooms in the heart of the city and wrote letters home describing the wealth, the filth, the noise, and the restaurant prices. You can eat the most hearty dinner for 32 sous in a restaurant with mirrors, gilding, and gas lighting. And the next, you can eat lunch where they will give you just enough for a bird to eat and charge 3 times as much. If Chopin's passion for Constantia in Warsaw had been all in the mind, clearly by the time he arrived in Paris, he was no longer quite so sexually innocent. An encounter with a girl called Teresa in Austria had left him with some unpleasant side effects. He wrote to one of his friends back in Poland, "The memory of Teresa forbids me to taste forbidden fruit. But I already know several lady vocalists, and lady vocalists here are even more anxious for duets than those in the Tyrol." But what really excited the young composer about being in Paris was the opera and the opportunity to hear the world's greatest singers.
Paris in the 1830s and 1840s was the cultural capital of the Western world. This had various implications for Chopin. For one thing, he could hear the best orchestras in the world which were based there. Some of the best musicians were based there. But also he could hear all those who were bound to come through Paris.
When he arrived, he wrote that, she is here, he sings there, I've heard her singing, and all at the same place, at the same moment, at the same time. So it was really a paradise for him to be in Paris at this time.
There's the premiere at the Opéra of Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable, which is an opera that is almost forgotten now. In the 19th century, it was the most performed opera of any work. The main singer that he liked in Robert was the soprano Cinti Damaro, and he was incredibly taken with her voice. She was famous for being able to sing chromatic scales as if she were playing them on the piano. And at a time when it's clear that lots of singers, even some of the most renowned singers, were not always particularly precise, people loved the fact that, and Chopin included, loved the fact that her performance sounded almost like an instrument playing.
It's not that he discovered opera in Paris, but he discovered the best singers, he discovered the best pieces because he could hear Rossini, Bellini, e tutti quanti. Really, he could have an access, a direct access to the core of the inspiration of his own music.
The big question is, why didn't Chopin, the brilliant young composer, write for the opera, an art form that he clearly adored?
It's very clear that little by little, he recognizes that the circumstances have changed. First of all, the fall of the November uprising meant that even in Poland, national opera could not be performed. The fact that he did settle in Paris and did not return to Poland meant that he would be writing a Polish language opera in France, which was meaningless and futile. But perhaps also his inclination, his natural inclination towards the piano. This was the medium that he was the most comfortable in. So I think in some way what he did is he channeled opera-like narratives into his larger works. They become miniature operas.
When Chopin arrived in Paris, aged 21, he had already composed a substantial body of extraordinary music. Within a year, he was a fashionable celebrity, not just for his composition, but also for his mesmerizing and uniquely delicate style of playing.
It was a wonderful atmosphere because Chopin played, and some say that he played at midnight, for instance, the nocturne. Can you imagine the nocturne at midnight? And it was an enchantment, really. It was an enchantment because it was private. The music was for yourself. And the people in the salon were very happy, they're very confident in being the only ones to hear. It was a privilege.
The poet Théophile Gautier wrote, Chopin stands for a melancholic elegance, a dreamy charm, a female sensitivity. Touched with his fingers, the keys seem to be brushed by an angel's wing. Instead of writing for the opera house, Chopin's theatre was the salon, the intimate, sophisticated world in which the aristocracy and the artistic community intermingled. It was for this audience that throughout the 1830s and 40s, he produced a prolific range of concise, poetic piano music, mazurkas, waltzes, atmospheric nocturnes, and electrifying studies. Occasionally, he also found time to compose songs, usually as gifts for society ladies. One of these ladies was a young Polish countess. Her name was Delfina Potocka. She was not only Polish, she was beautiful, wealthy, and clearly a wonderful singer. She was one of the very first of Chopin's Parisian friends, and remained close to him right up to his death. This lake at Enghien, a few miles north of Paris, has often been associated with a possible romance between them.
During that period, she was leading a very liberated lifestyle, separated from her husband and having scandalous affairs with famous people.
The nature of the relationship between Chopin and Potocka has been the source of endless speculation and gossip. One of the most intriguing rumors is that during the summer of 1836, Chopin stayed in a villa that Delfina had rented by this lake. A year later, Chopin was passing Enghien with a Polish friend who described in his diary how Chopin had turned my attention to the wide lake, and on its edge the little villa in which he had spent the previous summer. His face became suffused with the pleasantness of the memory. It must have been a very happy period of his life. The story was revived again as recently as the 1940s, when a mysterious bundle of semi-pornographic letters, alleged correspondence between Chopin and Potocka, was discovered by one of Potocka's descendants. The letters horrified scholars, mostly because of what was seen as the un-Chopin-like bedroom language. The letters were dismissed as forgeries, but then tragically the relative committed suicide, and the letters disappeared. However, the debate about their authenticity still rumbles on.
What interests me about the relationship between Chopin and Delfina is not the possibility of a love affair between them. In my opinion, it's quite likely that it never happened. On the contrary, what I'm much more interested to know is that she put words on one of the last nocturnes of Chopin, which she played in front of him, and which he found, and I quote his words, "Ça se chantait bien." It sang itself well. I think that the fact that they shared the same musical ideals is so much more interesting than a love affair.
Marie-Paul Rambaud's reluctance to accept the idea of a Chopin-Potocka love affair is based on the simple lack of evidence. The shortage of information about this or other parts of Chopin's romantic life has generated a long-running debate about his sexuality. How can a man who wrote such passionate music have had such an apparently limited love life? We'll never know whether he slept with Delphina or any of the other singers in his life, but there's no doubting the attraction they had for him.
Much is made of the importance to Chopin of singers in his life. Relatively few of the singers that he mentions and admires are men. The vast bulk of them are women. And I think there was something about the woman's voice and also the woman's singing as a means of Chopin being able to approach that woman, because he was basically quite shy. In fact, he was basically very shy. And I think in a strange way that women singing, can I be so coarse as to say, turned him on?
The best evidence of Chopin's friendship with Delphina Potocka lies in the music which he dedicated to her, including his great F minor piano concerto. The slow movement may have been inspired by Constantia back in Warsaw, but when the concerto was eventually published in Paris, it was Delphina's name that graced the finished work's cover. Because of his reputation in the salons, Chopin was in great demand as a piano teacher, and this became his principal source of income.
In Paris, music had become the ultimate form of art for not just the moneyed rich, at the head of whom stood the great bankers such as the Rothschilds, but also of the highest aristocracy, who all sent their daughters for lessons to Chopin at unimaginable prices.
He seems to have made very good money from that, and good enough money that after a year or so of teaching piano, he could start teaching piano in his own apartments once he'd moved to the Rue Chaussée-d'Antin, which was one of the most fashionable roads to be on in Paris at the time.
Chopin seldom talked about the composition of his music, but there are many highly revealing accounts of his approach to playing and teaching the piano.
Yes, Chopin did encourage his pupils to sing with the fingers. He introduced a new kind of technique in which the fingers were not surrogate hammers, but in which the hand and the arm and the elbow and everything came into play as a kind of choreography of the entire arm. He treated the hand as a cast of characters, just as he treated the scale as a cast of characters. And his favorite singing finger was the third, this long finger. And how did that sing best? Because he used it as the center of a kind of stroking mechanism. And with Chopin, I've adapted this into my own teaching. I liken it to the stroking of a lion's mane. He did not come down from it above. He did not go tack, 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 tack. He kept saying in his teaching all the time, facilement, facilement, easily, easily. Well, he wrote, his etudes are simply about as difficult as music gets. I mean, they are unbelievably difficult. And his motto was souplesse avant tout, suppleness before everything. And one astounding thing about these incredibly difficult Chopin etudes is that the testimony of his pupils repeatedly says that he made it easy. That what they had thought was insurmountably challenging became natural and easy. Now, this is really something I would love to have had lessons with him. Who wouldn't?
In 1836, 6 years after arriving in Paris, Chopin met a female novelist called George Sand. Sand, at 33, was 6 years older than him. A famous bohemian, a political radical, she often dressed in men's clothes and, most notoriously, smoked cigars in public. Sand fell passionately in love with Chopin, and gradually over the next 2 years, he was seduced.
The most bewildering of the relationships and the dominant relationship of Chopin's life was his relationship with the unbelievably scandalous, highly sexed, extravagant, megalomaniacal Georges Sand.
To avoid the gossip that their relationship was beginning to attract, they decided to spend the winter of 1838 together on the then remote island of Mallorca, accompanied by Sand's 2 young children. That winter on Mallorca, the 28-year-old Chopin became seriously ill and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. From this point on, his life was dominated by the progression of the disease. Because of the locals' fear of being infected by him, Chopin, Sand, and the children were forced to leave the house they were renting, and they ended up in rooms in a deserted monastery at Valdemosa. Chopin wrote to a friend with his typically waspish humor, "I have been as sick as a dog these last 2 weeks. I caught cold in spite of 18 degrees of heat, roses, oranges, palms, figs, and 3 of the most famous doctors on the island. One sniffed at what I spat up. The second tapped where I spat from. The third poked about and listened to how I spat it. One said that I had died, the second that I am dying, the third that I shall die." Despite his illness, during his time on Mallorca, Chopin completed one of his greatest collections of work, the Preludes, 24 short, poetic masterpieces for piano. Eventually, Chopin had to be taken off the island, and after a long period of recovery in Marseille, they arrived at Nohant in June 1839, Sand's family home in the heart of rural France. Chopin and Sand spent the next 8 years together, and the long summers at Nohant gave the frail Chopin a suitably quiet and restorative atmosphere in which to compose.
She created conditions for him to work in, to be happy in. It's difficult to know who else could have given him that kind of stability and that kind of security other than her.
It was at Nohant that Chopin formed a close musical friendship with a protégé of Sand's, a young singer and composer called Pauline Viardot.
He loved Pauline being there. He always said that she had such joie de vivre, such élan, that when she was around, however depressed or lacking in inspiration he might have been, she could always renew his creative spirit. And she just seemed that sort of person. She would walk into a room and suddenly you'd feel a light had been turned on, you know? He felt that she was a really kindred spirit, that right from the word go, they understood each other musically.
One of the most rewarding aspects of their friendship was the way they fed one another's musical composition. This song is a setting of one of Chopin's mazurkas, his short Polish-style pieces, arranged and set to words by Pauline.
Pour
It must have been fun for them to collaborate, maybe.
Oh,
something
yes.
Like that.
She used to, at first, with a bit of trepidation, show him what she was composing. And she wrote to Georges Sand saying that she'd just written a song called Le Roseau et le Chêne, and she wanted to show it to Chopin, but she was a bit afraid in case he didn't think it was good enough. Well, he obviously did, because he played it for her at the concert at Salle Pleyel in 1842.
At the National Library of France, Nicolas Dufetel was keen to show James some graphic evidence of this collaboration between Chopin and Viardot.
They sang at a concert in the Salon Pleyel a melody by Pauline Viardot, Le Chêne et le Roseau. And there is a manuscript here in the Bibliothèque Nationale with Chopin's corrections. So he helped her for the composition and for the interpretation.
I see.
So do you want to see it?
I'd love to see. And it has his writing on it?
Yes, with a pencil.
So I can't touch it, obviously.
Sorry. This is Le Chêne et le Roseau. This manuscript could be the one used for the concert. So it was in Chopin's hands.
Yeah.
You see his handwriting. Wow. So you see the handwriting very applicated because it has to be used. And Chopin is quite shaky.
Yes.
Because it was certainly written on the piano. So you can imagine Pauline Viardot standing up.
Well,
and
I
Chopin
do the same
sitting.
thing. I write on the piano
and
how to
Chopin
play.
is the same, of course.
Yeah.
During the long summers at Nohant, Chopin composed not just exquisite miniatures, but longer-scale works. His fantasies, ballads, the famous B-flat minor sonata. One of the last works to be completed there was the challenging, dreamlike Polonaise Fantaisie. Much of Chopin's composition was born out of his extraordinary powers of improvisation, which never failed to dazzle an audience. A guest at Georges Sand's salon commented, "The other day, I heard Chopin improvise. It is marvelous to hear him compose in this way. His inspiration is so immediate and complete that he plays without hesitation, as though it had to be thus. But when it comes to writing it down and recapturing the original thought in all its details, he spends days of nervous strain and almost frightening desperation. He alters and retouches the same phrases incessantly and walks up and down like a madman." Chopin and Georges Sand lived side by side for 8 years, both at Nohant and at apartments here at the Square d'Orléans. But in 1847, their by now uneasy relationship collapsed in bitterness when Chopin sided with Sand's daughter in a family row. In June 1848, the year after his separation from Sens, alone, short of money and in deteriorating health, things got even worse for Chopin when Paris descended into chaos. Troops fired on a demonstrating crowd, sparking a new revolution. The French King Louis-Philippe was overthrown, and when he fled to England, the French aristocracy followed swiftly behind, fearing another reign of terror. Chopin had no choice but to follow his clients to London. London was where he met the last of the great singers in his life. Her name was Jenny Lind, one of the most famous divas of the 19th century. Lind was born in the back streets of Stockholm, a devout Protestant, disciplined and driven, who went on to conquer the European opera stage while still a teenager, and then triumph on a grand tour of America organized by P.T. Barnum, where she was seen by over 1 million people and paid today's equivalent of more than $5 million. By the time they met, Chopin had all but finished composing. But his friendship with Lind reveals the effect a great voice could still have on the composer. James and Natalia traveled to Brussels to meet a Scandinavian couple, Cecilia and Jens Jorgensen. The Jorgensens have spent the last 7 years exploring the relationship between Chopin and Lind. They both had careers in business, but since retiring have been caught up like so many before them in the mysteries and uncertainties surrounding Chopin's life. Cecilia first became intrigued when she read of Chopin's encounter with her fellow Swede Jenny Lind. Since then, she and Jens have been working as researcher-cum-detectives, trying to uncover what happened between these two great musicians.
There's a lot of mystery around Chopin, isn't there? Almost kind of mythical quality.
In fact, you are a bit like Chopin. Do you know that? I mean, he writes. He's got a lot of humor, and he's very good at observing situations.
Extremely good looking.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know that I was going to add that point.
I should cough more.
Yeah.
The long nose. Yes, that's a good start.
What fascinates me is we're talking about, you know, the last few months of his life. What was it that actually really got you to sit up and think, wow, there's something really new here, something really intriguing? And you spent, what, 7, 8 years now?
Today, nobody else has ever spoken about Chopin and Jenny Lind, no other scholars, so it's kind of new information in general. There are sort of clear evidence, of course, that Chopin and Jenny Lind had a very special relationship that went far beyond a mere acquaintance.
Okay.
You can hear from his letters that they had a close relationship. There's a letter from Jenny Lind to a friend from the 9th of November, 1849, that is just 9 days after his funeral. And in that she talks about her loss of Chopin, and that she feels numb by this loss. After his death, she wrote music to his mazurkas.
An arrangement.
Yeah, an arrangement
for voice and piano.
For voice and piano, and it's faithful love will never die.
So how did the ailing Polish composer and this young Swedish singer meet? In April 1848, Chopin arrived in London, where he took an apartment in fashionable Mayfair, probably paid for with the help of wealthy British patrons.
There was a glut of musicians who poured over from the continent in 1848, largely to escape the violence and the infighting that was going on in Paris, particularly. So you get Pianists such as Thalberg, Kalkbrenner, Chopin, obviously. Berlioz comes over as well. He sees this as a place that offers him refuge.
It's number 48 Dover Street, where Chopin stayed shortly after his arrival.
And we know that he came here about a week after his arrival in London. And we know that from the piano firm Broadwood, from their records, that they delivered a piano on that day, on the 27th of April. That's quite interesting.
So it was up there somewhere?
Yeah.
Well, probably the modern building.
Chopin writes that I finally have a room in which I can breathe and play.
At the point at which Chopin came to London and tried to establish himself in 1848, he was a very sick man. He certainly was by the end of several months of trekking around London society, being introduced to the ton, the fashionable crowds. Probably the most prestigious appearance that Chopin made whilst in London was his presentation to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at Stafford House. This was at a gathering hosted by the Duchess of Sutherland. And Stafford House was a very, very beautiful, still is, it's now known as Lancaster House, a very, very beautiful setting for a concert, just a stone's throw from St James's Palace. And Chopin was presented to the Queen and the Prince Consort. His sense was that he was politely welcomed.
By 1848, Jenny Lind was London's most celebrated singer. She was earning huge fees, and her performances were the hottest ticket in town.
Fascinating, this whole phenomenon of Lind mania, and how quickly the merchandising and the marketing started. You know, she was on the cover of chocolate boxes. There was a tulip named after her. There was a pub in Hastings called the Jenny Lind, which she would not have approved of. I'm sure she didn't approve of public houses.
Queen Victoria loved the opera, and she loved prima donnas, she loved singers, perhaps most significantly Jenny Lind. So when Jenny Lind came to London, finally came to London and took up an engagement at Her Majesty's Theatre, she was captivated, and she, I think, attended every single one of Jenny Lind's performances that season.
On May the 11th, 1848, Chopin heard Jenny Lind sing for the first time at Her Majesty's Theatre in a performance of Bellini's opera La Sonnambula. Ed Gardner, music director of English National Opera, is working with Natalia on the most famous number from Sonnambula, an aria indelibly associated with Jenny Lind and her distinctive style of singing.
Where does it come in the piece, in the opera, and what is the character feeling when she comes to sing it?
It comes quite near the end, and she's sleepwalking, so she's being quite honest, I'd imagine. She doesn't know that anyone's listening to her.
So it's private in a way,
So it's very,
isn't it?
and very intimate, yeah.
And that private, that kind of chambery colour, I guess, is something which I think is a real fingerprint of the piece, and something which I think Chopin said about Jenny Lind singing, that it had this sort of finesse in its piano about it.
Yes.
Sort of an evenness, but a finesse as well.
Amina in La Sonnambula by Bellini was probably her most famous role. La Sonnambula, the sleepwalker. It just sort of fitted her personality in the most wonderful way. It's about a very pure village girl in Switzerland, who is thought to have been seen in a gentleman's bedroom, and her honour is impugned and scandal threatens.
You sing it beautifully.
It turns out that she's a sleepwalker, and everybody's very relieved that in fact she turns out to be absolutely the unsullied virgin. And of course this fitted the whole Jenny Lind mythology to a T, apart from the fact that I think the music obviously suited her beautifully.
Why does he write these breaks after Si presto estinto? What are those rests for?
Emotion.
Yeah, that's it, because you can't carry the phrase on.
No.
And we kind of need to hear that, and it can't feel too comfortable in the way that you sing it.
Yeah.
Should we try it again?
Yes.
Si presto estinto o fiore passasti al mar d'amore che un giorno solo
It was one of those voices, like Maria Callas's, which was instantly recognisable. Of course, there are no recordings of it, so we don't actually know what it sounded like, but Chopin said it reminded him of the Northern Lights. And other people said that it reminded them of the smell of pine trees. There was something very, very fresh, something very, very cool, something very, very pure about it.
In a letter back to Warsaw, Chopin was unusually effusive about Lind. She is enormously effective in Sonnambula. She sings with extreme purity and conviction, and her piano notes are steady and even as a hair. The night after Chopin heard Jenny singing La Sonnambula, he was invited to a small supper party with her at the Belgravia home of their mutual friend, a Mrs. Grota.
So what happened in Mrs. Grota's house that evening?
That's a very leading question.
Loaded question.
But what we know is that they played together. They were sitting at the piano, both of them, from 9 till 1 in the night. That's 4 hours. We know that Mrs. Grota arranged for Chopin. So she invited him to a dinner, and when he got there, the only other guest was Jenny Lind.
You think she was playing a kind of matchmaker?
Yeah, and I think that Jenny Lind must have expressed the wish to see him.
He's not a matchmaker, but at least to make these two great musical personalities to meet, because clearly Chopin was impressed by Jenny Lind's performance.
I mean, do we know what they played? Or?
No, we can only... Says she usually played Swedish things, as he talks about it, because they do meet soon after again, where he says, she played me Swedish things till midnight.
Chopin alludes to the fact that she had taken, as it were, the music of Scandinavia, the melodies of her country, and translated them into something else. He thought he perceived in her something very akin to what he was doing, and it was an extraordinary musical experience for him, which was saying quite a lot because not much was exciting him by then. He was pretty jaded, pretty depressed, so the fact that Jenny Lind made such an impression says a lot about her and how he understood her.
The Jorgensens' research has led them to develop a new theory that Chopin and Lind had some kind of romance in the summer of 1848. Although Jenny was on tour around Britain and Chopin was mostly in Scotland, the Jorgensens are convinced that their letters reveal clues of powerful emotions. Miss Lind came to my concert. She never sings anywhere but in the opera, but she would have sung for me, according to Mrs. Grote. Jenny Lind and Mrs. Grote, who I met at the station, have been here and have gone on to Glasgow for a performance. If I were younger, if I were not prostrate under my affections as I am, I might be able to start life again.
Chopin writes already in June in London, I prostrate under my feelings. I wish I was younger. Now, that is open for a very clear interpretation of what he's talking about there. So the romance started already in London, clearly, and continued. There was an opportunity, all sorts of opportunities.
There is no hard evidence of a Chopin-Lind romance, but it's not difficult to understand why there might be speculation. Clearly, her voice made a huge impression on Chopin. In November 1848, despite very poor health, Chopin played at a grand Polish ball at London's Guildhall.
He played at the concert on the way back from Scotland. He was very ill. He'd caught a chill on the way back to London. And he was effectively providing music from an anteroom. He played for about an hour, his usual short, characteristic pieces. And nobody really paid him any attention, and certainly we don't get comment in the press. You'd have thought that such an event would have been a great platform for him, that he would have been a great centrepiece. His performance would have been a great centrepiece at this event, but unfortunately it almost passed without notice. And he left, returned to Paris, and that was his last public performance.
Although this last performance may have been a dismal event, Chopin's final years as a composer produced some of his most powerful work, some of the great masterpieces of the piano repertoire, including a work about which James is passionate, the Fourth Ballade.
There are plenty of wonderful moments here.
Looking at the ballade with his Italian teacher Edoardo Strabioli, James is exploring how to bring out the bel canto singing line within the piece.
But I felt that you cut a couple of times this long line.
Yeah.
I don't think we need. I mean, because of the bel canto has to be easy to follow, and somehow this, of course, I know that is important to notice, but not to stop the line. The upper line has to.
The whole concept of the piece is really taking a line from a song and turning it into this, maelstrom of variations and notes.
Careful not to make accent on the short notes, because I can feel a pa-dam, pa-bing, pa-pam, pam-pam. This happens because we have not the voice.
The theme has a hugely song-like quality. Even though it's the simplest of themes, it's one of the deepest pieces. I don't think he ever exposes himself more than in that piece.
Emmanuel Ax is one of the world's greatest Chopin interpreters, and James met up with him while he was rehearsing at the Barbican Hall in London.
To slow down here.
He asked him how important he thinks the singing line is throughout the Chopin repertoire.
If you play anything of Chopin very slowly, it still sounds good. You know, all the fast etudes that are meant to be played at an absurd rate of speed, especially if you follow his metronome markings, which are, I think, impossible for any human being. But in fact, if you're just practicing, if you just play slowly, it sounds so good. You know, it sounds like a beautiful singing line at a slow tempo. So I think he was always thinking that way.
And in the fourth ballade too, of course.
In that piece in particular, what I've always felt is that he seems to somehow find a way of going from absolutely the most simple and kind of not outward music to something that is completely passionate and then actually goes haywire.
Sure.
You know, so you start with just that, and then the next time you add a little bit, pop, 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 and the next time you add a little bit of that, and then the next time you start going a little bit mad. Everything actually not in units of 4 or 8 or 3, but always 7 or 10 or something crazy, you know. And then eventually comes the coda, which is literally berserk.
Yeah, especially
so
after the calm.
So I think in this piece, it really goes from that to, and the more you can find a way of doing that, I think the grander the performance becomes. So it's difficult at the beginning, especially, to find a way of playing really, really beautifully and really simply. I don't know, I haven't found it yet, but that's what I'm looking for.
The main thing we can be sure of in Chopin's personal life is that we don't know the whole story. But in his music, although we don't get answers, we do get a sense of the sheer depth of his emotional experience. And it's this that's so relentlessly attractive to artists like James. In November 1848, in failing health, Chopin returned to Paris to consult his doctors. Intriguingly, Jenny Lind made an unexpected visit to Paris the following spring, as soon as she had completed her contract at Her Majesty's Theatre. This was despite the fact that she disliked Paris, and at the time of her visit, the city was in the grip of a severe cholera outbreak. For 3 weeks, she stayed in a house on the Champs-Élysées, and Chopin wrote in a letter that she had visited him and sung in his apartment. Eventually, fearing for her health, Jenny left the city. She must have been painfully aware that she would probably never see him again. Shortly after her departure, Chopin received a mysterious package containing 25,000 francs to cover his considerable debts. The money may have come from his Scottish piano student, Jane Stirling. But Jenny Lind was famous for her wealth and philanthropy. Was this perhaps a farewell gift from her? Jenny Lind wasn't the only one of the singers who rallied round. Pauline Viardot was in regular contact and sent reports of his health to George Sand. And his old friend, the beautiful Polish Countess Delfina Potocka's name appears regularly in the correspondence of his final months. In September 1849, Chopin's friends rented him a small apartment in Paris's grandest square, the Place Vendôme. It was situated in the magnificent building that is now home to the ancient French jewelry house of Chaumet.
What an incredible place.
Yes.
It's enormous.
Yes, it's with a view on the Place Vendôme.
Yeah.
According to Beatrice de Plainval, Chopin was accommodated in a small apartment on the ground floor. This grand salon was at the time rented by Delfina Potocka.
She wrote that on the 15th of October 1849, on that day, she is visiting Chopin, and he was terribly anxious. And he asked her, he told her, I don't want to live the life without the song of my piano. Could you manage something for me? So she decided to move the bed of Chopin. Where was the piano? It means here. And he spent the last 3 days of his life here. So in such beautiful room, with that view on the Place Vendôme, we live with Chopin here.
Yeah.
You feel it.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the 15th of October, as this painting describes, Delfina Potocka sang to Chopin as he lay dying on his bed here in this room. People argue over what she sang and who else was here. But what's most fascinating is that Chopin's last request was not so much to hear a piano or his own music, but the sound of a woman's voice.
It's my little office.
Beatrice had one more thing to show James and Natalia.
Show me your hand. That's a beautiful hand.
Oh, well, thank you.
Mine is here because I have a little problem, which is, voila.
Wow.
Look here. This is the hand of Chopin.
Amazing. Can I put mine on top?
Yes.
Like, I'm shaking. Can you see? It's amazing.
It's very similar.
It's not so different,
Yeah,
huh?
no, so different. Long fingers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And very skinny.
Yes,
mouth.
that's why he was tuberculosis. This is a moulage at the end of his life.
It's almost like a child's hand.
Yes, but look how delicate he is. You see?
And the wrists
The
too,
wrist
like
is,
mine, very small and
very
thin.
similar.
Wow.
Yeah. And you see.
Just amazing. Amazing.
Living here myself since 40 years, I have the emotion. This is the test of the genius. When you live on the Place Vendôme and when you live in this salon, And when each day you have the emotion,
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. Very good.
Even you. Let's do something one day.
Around 2 o'clock in the morning of October the 17th, 1849, Chopin died. He was 39 years old.
Chopin was very famous being a teacher, being a pianist, being a composer. But when he died, I mean, it was the true beginning of his legacy.
Chopin's funeral was an extraordinary and spectacular affair. The facade of this grand church, the Church of the Madeleine, was draped with huge black velvet cloths. In the center, a large badge embroidered in silver with the initials FC. The church was packed with up to 3,000 people. French and Polish aristocrats and fashionable society far outnumbered Chopin's friends and fellow musicians. The ceremony began with a momentous orchestral arrangement of Chopin's own B-flat minor sonata. The highlight of this grand ceremony was a full performance of Mozart's Requiem. Among the soloists was Chopin's friend and collaborator, Pauline Viardot. The magnificence of Chopin's funeral gives some indication of the strength of his reputation at the time of his death.
The astonishing thing is that he managed to impose his own method and his own will and his own standards and his own way of doing things on the musical world. He turned himself into a kind of a sort of untouchable in a way. By the beginning of the 1840s in Paris, he had a completely unique position. He didn't have to give endless concerts to prove how good he was. He gave pitifully few concerts and was heard by very, very few people. And yet the entire musical world was utterly convinced that he was right up there as possibly the greatest.
He ceased to be a human being in the eyes of his audiences, in the eyes of Poles, of the Polish intelligentsia in particular, long before he died. He became an idea. He became a monument.
After his death, Chopin's heart was removed from his body and taken to Warsaw to be venerated in a special tomb, currently being renovated in time for the grand bicentenary celebrations. This canonization of Chopin is undoubtedly one of the reasons why the history and the legend of Chopin's life are sometimes hard to unravel. Certainly, the details of Chopin's relationship with all of the singers in his life remain tantalizingly incomplete. What's undeniable is their legacy. Chopin's great achievement was to find not just a new musical language, but a new voice for the piano. Through his singing style of composing and playing, he discovered an almost organic human sound within the instrument, and it's this echo of the human voice within his music that gives it a power that still mesmerizes us today. Although we will never know exactly what the voices of Konstancja Gladkowska, Delfina Potocka, Pauline Viardot or Jenny Lind really sounded like, their singing is immortalized somewhere deep inside Chopin's music.